Hello, 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 and welcome to something completely new, something completely different, something that I've never done on my channel before. As you can see, in front of me here is a tier list, because what I'm going to be doing is ranking 32 different realms and kingdoms in Middle-earth. There's a few things I do want to say first. The first thing is that not all realms are included. I haven't put in evil realms such as Angband, Mordor, Isengard because I don't feel it's fair to rank them in the same list as the Free Peoples because they had different goals. The second thing is that there are a bunch of, I say, minor places missing. Places like Dolomin and Ladros because they're vassal states and they never really stood by themselves politically or geographically. And then there's other places missing, like Ethelond or Bree, because, we don't really know enough about them to fairly rank them on this list, I'd say. As you can see, I have S to D. S is the greatest of the great, D is places that were kind of shit, and it would have been better off if they never existed. I will say that there isn't an exact scoring method to this. I'm ranking places sort of by power, their impact, and a bunch of other, I'd say, subjective things. I'm just ranking them on vibe, really. I don't know. So, yeah, let's start. Okay, as you can see, we have all the places down here. I've ranked them by alphabetical order. First, we have Arnor. Okay, everyone knows how much I love Arnor. I've done so many videos on it, and I think there's always more videos that can be done. Also, because I'm recording this live and without a script, I would just like to say that I apologize if any background noise sneaks into the video because I do live on a busy street in a busy city, and I'm convinced that motorbikes are the worst things that were ever created by humans. Anyway, Arnor. Now, as much as I love Arnor, I do have to say that Arnor didn't really do much. It was founded. It was always weaker than its sister kingdom, but that's fine. It participated in one major war, and then it sort of just went downhill from there, kind of all just self-inflicted. It didn't really have major close enemies at the time. It just sort of slowly bled out, like in a really sad way, and then it split into 3 successor states. The kingdom didn't even last really 1,000 years, I don't think. So while I can't say that Arnor had a negative impact, it doesn't deserve to go in D. I don't think I can really rank it any higher than C, to be honest. It sort of existed, it was there, it didn't do much, and then it just kind of killed itself. So Arnor goes in C. I hope you guys can actually see which place is which. Some of them should be kind of obvious, because Arnor is very big. Some of the smaller ones might be a bit more difficult. Okay. Then we've got Arthedain. Arthedain is the main successor kingdom of Arnor, the biggest and strongest of the 3. Now, I don't want to put Arthedain in C like Arnor because Arthedain actually faced some challenges. They had to fight some wars, and they lasted a lot longer than the other successor states did. They did put up quite a bit of a fight. And I feel like, Arthedain was sort of... It didn't start from a strong place. It was let down by Arnor. So it's kind of hard to blame the Kings of Arthedain for that. I don't think there's really much else to say about Arthedain. I'm going to put them in B. I feel like they deserve B. Okay, here we have Belegost. Belegost was one of the 2 Dwarven kingdoms in the Blue Mountains in the First Age. We don't know a huge amount about Belegost. Their most iconic moment comes in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where they were the last army to quit the field, at least out of the Eastern Army led by Maedhros. Their lord had a really badass moment where he stabbed Glaurung in the stomach. They also tried to talk the dwarves of Nogrod out of attacking Doriath. They lasted through the First Age, which is more than what most places did. They unfortunately, their Belagos was seemingly destroyed in the cataclysm that sunk Beleriand. I feel like I feel like they only had a positive impact on things. They lasted quite a long time. They were sort of destroyed in an event that was sort of out of their control. Honestly, I feel like Belagos deserves an A. I think it's it was one of the better places in the First Age, I'd say. Okay, here we have the Blue Mountains. Now, the Blue Mountains, I was sort of hesitant on including them in the list because, well, it's hard to say that they were their own, like, kingdom, I guess. I feel like they were, though, because dwarves continued living there the entire time. Even though Belagos and Nogrod got destroyed, dwarves did stay living in the Blue Mountains, and for a brief time, the Thrain and Thorin were kings of Durin's folk who were ruling out of the Blue Mountains. So I'd definitely say that the Blue Mountains were its own realm. And separate to the realms of Nogrod and Belagos. So what would I say about the Blue Mountains? I mean, they just kind of survived. They hung around. They didn't really do much. They didn't have a whole lot of impact on things. They were just chilling in the far west of Middle Earth, just mining away. They weren't overly rich, weren't overly powerful. I think you sort of just have to give them a B for just sort of, you know, it being a nice place to live, really. Like, I don't think I could rate them any higher or lower, because I don't think there was enough good things that they did, but at the same time, I don't think there was enough bad things about the Blue Mountains. So I think Blue Mountains, they go in B. Okay, Brethil. Brethil is the only mannish state I'm including from the First Age, because it was the only state that wasn't really a vassal of any other states. The men of Brethil were completely independent. This one's kind of tough, because the men of Brethil weren't powerful. They were probably the weakest of the three houses, and their legacy ended up being the smallest. I mean, the men of Brethil were almost entirely wiped themselves out in the end. Very few Paladin influence made it to Numenor, to the point where they didn't even recognize the language later on. But I think when Brethil was around, they really did give it their all. I mean, they participated in all the major battles that they could, even after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, when it was, when Beleriand seemed doomed. The men of Brethil really gave it a good go in defending their lands, their territory, really against overwhelming odds. I think for how small Brethil was, they packed a pretty hard punch. So I think I'm going to rank them in B. I don't think they deserve to really be any lower than that, and I don't think they really deserve to be higher than that, because their legacy was just really limited. Even though they lasted the longest of the three houses of the Adain in the First Stage in terms of independence, they ended up having the smallest legacy, which is really unfortunate. But yeah, I think they deserve a solid B. Cardolan. Cardolan, the second successor state. Or third. Cardolan and Rudau are never really given an order. I mean, one thing we have to say about Cardolan is that they didn't betray Arnor in the end. They did fight alongside Arthedain. They fought against them first, but then they did fight alongside them. So they did help out in the wars against Angmar. They weren't overly effective in the end. In the invasion of 1409, Cardolan was really badly ravaged, and they didn't really come back from that. They sort of existed as a rump state that was semi-independent, I guess you could say, for the next 200 or so years, and then they got wiped out by the Great Plague. I don't think I can really rank them higher than a C, to be honest, because they didn't achieve all that much. It's just an example of how Arnor would have been better if they all stayed together. They weren't bad, but they just didn't do that much. They got torn apart by Angmar fairly early, and it was kind of a sad existence. We're gonna have to put them in C, unfortunately. Okay, this looks like Dale. Now, Dale was it was a city-state at first. When Thror was king under the mountain, Dale was a city-state, but then after Smaug was killed, Bard became king of Dale and ended up not just being king of the city, but king of a whole load of land to the south and east. So Dale, it has the, how could you say, the legacy of being the third kingdom of men in the late Third Age. The third kingdom of men that often gets forgotten, that still fought in the War of the Ring. But I just don't think, we don't really know much about Dale. We don't know how strong they were. All we kind of know is that in the War of the Ring, Dale was the only sort of land of the Free Peoples that was overrun by the bad guys. King Brand fought against the Easterlings and lost pretty badly. He himself was killed, and his people had to basically hide in Arabore. So, despite how I think they were quite rich, that was one thing they had going for them, because they lived by the Lonely Mountain. But they were just middlemen as well, though. But I think simply because they probably wouldn't have survived, they would have had a really short run. I think if Sauron hadn't been defeated when he was, Dale would have ceased to exist as a kingdom basically, 70 or so years after it was founded. It would have only had 3 kings. So, I think simply because it just did so poorly in its first war, it was a tough war, but I think simply because it just did so poorly, I don't think I can rank them any higher than the sea, unfortunately. Doriath. Okay. What can we say about Doriath? Doriath was powerful. It was long-lasting. It lasted a very long time. But a lot of that was due to the fact that it did just close its borders. It just didn't help. They had a magical barrier around their lands that evil couldn't really enter. And then they ended up sort of just... when King Thingol was murdered by dwarves, they ended up, losing pretty badly after that. Doriath was attacked by the dwarves, and they lost. And then they were attacked again by the Feanorians, and that was the end of Doriath. I mean, I think some credit has to be given for the survivability. Doriath did last a very long time, and it was powerful enough to defend its borders, as long as it had strong leadership. I think it just, unfortunately, just because of how, when Thingol died, just how poorly it did after that. I think I'm going to give it a B. It's simply because of survivability. It lasted a very long time. Doriath, for the longest time, was the safest place in Beleriand. And I think it does deserve credit for that. While everywhere else was falling apart, Doriath was safe. And, in the end, it needed some inside scandalous behavior to bring it down, so... Okay, we have Dorthonion. So, Dorthonion was ruled by the brothers of King Finrod, Felagund, Angrod, and Aegnor. They were vassals of King Finrod, but Dorthonion was quite far from Nargothrond. So I put them in this list because, they were geographically independent of Nargothrond. They were their own lordship in that way. Dorthonion was quite weak in terms of the powers of the First Age. It was said to have had one of the smallest populations. It had some of the toughest fighters, but it was one of the smallest populations. And I think it wasn't a job people wanted. Because I think in the Battle of Sudden Flame, it proved that Dorthonion couldn't really stand by itself. And they were the first casualties of the war. Angrod and Aegnor were killed. So were most of the men of the House of Beor. I don't think I can really rank them higher than a C, simply because Dorthonion, they were brave, but they just weren't very strong. It's just that simple, I feel like. Okay, here we have Aethiod. So, there's not really a name of a state here. It's just the name of the people. The Aethiod were the survivors of the Kingdom of Rovanion after it was overrun by the Wain Riders. They ended up in the middle Vales of Anduin, but then migrated north to the upper Vales of Anduin. They did a pretty solid job. They had a pretty good life up there. They wiped out the remnants of Angmar, which were on the the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. They lived and prospered up there so much that they ended up, growing. Their population became too high for the lands that they were living in. One of their lords, Fram, he slew a dragon. That's pretty cool. And most importantly, they rode to Gondor's aid and really saved Gondor's ass during the Battle of the Field of Celebrant. I don't think there's really any negatives to Aethiod. I don't think they had the huge impact that lands them in an S, but I don't think you can really rank them any lower than A. It existed for quite a while. It helped out a lot. It had a happy ending. Yeah, I think A is suitable for the Aethiod. Okay, next we have Arabore, the Lonely Mountain. This one's tough, because despite how much Arabore is talked about by the dwarves as this amazing place, it was kind of, it wasn't their primary home. They lived there after the fall of Moria, and then they left for the Grey Mountains after a while. And then Thrall came back after they lost that home, and then they lost Arabore to Smaug, not that long after again. They ended up getting the mountain back, but then once again almost lost it to the Easterlings. Arabore was really rich, and it was quite a big deal, I guess. But I just don't think the Lonely Mountain doesn't really compare to what the dwarves had did in the past with Moria. I don't think it really even compares to Belagost. I think simply because it was quite rich, it was very important still. I think it does deserve to go above C. We'll put it in B, but yeah, I think Arabore is a little bit overrated. It didn't really achieve a huge amount, I would say. But, that's because it simply wasn't inhabited that long by the dwarves as well, so yeah, we'll put it in B. Okay, Eregion. The elven realm in the Second Age that was, depending on the sources, either founded by Celebrimbor or Galadriel. Famous for being the place where Sauron managed to get his hooks in and help create the Rings of Power. And I think that's really important when you think about the history of Eregion. Now, for Elven Realms, Eregion didn't last that long. It only lasted for, I think it was about 700 years or so? 800 years? 800 years. 800 to 900 years. I think that's how long it lasted. And then they were the only place to let Sauron in, which was, very important. Lothlorien and Lindon both barred the doors to Sauron. Eregion let Sauron in, where he was able to, help create the Rings of Power. And then this eventually ended up leading to the War of the Elves and Sauron, where Eregion held out for a bit, but it was then destroyed. So, while it's hard to say that, I don't think Eregion deserved to be in D because it didn't, screw things up. It doesn't really deserve to be any higher than C, I think. It's definitely the closest I feel like I've gotten to D so far. I know right now you're probably thinking, what does it take to land in A or D? But don't worry, we'll get there. Okay, the Falas. The Falas, ruled by everyone's favourite boy, Círdan. This was a very long-lasting state in the First Age, over by the coasts. They loved building ships and stuff. Círdan definitely gave it a go. I think one thing that was, I'm sort of thinking, with the Falas right now, is that the two times it got attacked, it really would have, the second time it got attacked, it got destroyed. The first time, it also would have been destroyed if not for the arrival of the Noldor, which really saved it. So, the Falas was, it did contribute a lot to the war, but it couldn't really survive on its own. It couldn't survive on its own 2 feet. But, yeah, Círdan helped out a lot. He really did. He contributed to many of the battles. He really did save Hiflam at one point. So I think just for that, just because even though they were, far away from the front line, they did contribute to the war a lot. And then even after the Phalas was destroyed, Círdan, kept being helpful. He had the Isle of Balar, and he would still send ships out to different places. I think we'll give him a B. I think, yeah, I feel bad ranking the Phalas in C. But it's close to a C, that's for certain. Alright, the Feanorians. Okay. The Feanorians are not really a realm, but I sort of lump them all together in because it's basically East Beleriand that was ruled by Maedhros, and his brothers were sort of vassals to him. Okay, well, what can we say about the Feanorians? The first thing, let's talk about the positive. Feanorians were one of the primary fighters against Morgoth. They were on the front line with Hiflam and Dorthonion. The Feanorians, they fought him all the time, basically. And now let's talk about the bad things. Well, the Feanorians fought Morgoth all the time, but they also got their asses kicked by him. Especially in the Battle of Sudden Flame. They did regain all their lands, but they did get their asses kicked then. The other important thing about the Feanorians is they screwed up things in Beleriand all the time. They ruined relationships with Doriath, they proceeded to then ruin relationships with Nargothrond, and then they let in the Easterlings, many of whom ended up betraying them and being loyal to Morgoth. And then who can forget the kinslayings? The second kinslaying where they destroyed Doriath, and then the third kinslaying where they destroyed the havens of Sirion. The Feanorians truly do, I think, they would 100% be a D, if not for the fact that they were one of the primary fighters against Morgoth. Because I guess they sort of, I don't know, would you argue that they cancelled out the good things they did with the bad things they did, or vice versa? It's hard to say. I'm going to give them a C simply because they did fight a lot against Morgoth, but then they just sabotaged themselves. They sabotaged the war effort. They really were kind of just loose units. Gondolind. Okay, this is kind of a tough one because Gondolind had the same strategy as Doriath. They were just like, yep, we're going to sit this war out. We're not really going to help out. But then they did help out. They helped out at the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. They sent an army of 10,000 to help the Western host. That was kind of a big deal. Gondolind was also a really beautiful place. It was a really nice place. It was probably the nicest place that was built in Beleriand, at least by the Noldor. Menegroth and Doriath might match it, but it was the nicest place built by the Noldor because it was the only place where they really built a proper city. Everywhere else they sort of built fortifications, like fortified cities. Gondolind was a proper city. This is tough. I'm leaning between A and B. Because it's... You know what? We're going to give Gondolind an A. We're going to put Gondolind an A. I think it had the longest legacy of any of the First Age kingdoms as well, because you hear about Gondolind in the Lord of the Rings. A bunch of swords from Gondolind still showed up. I mean, Eärendil was born in Gondolind. He who ended up, saving Beleriand. Well, it's hard to say he saved Beleriand because Beleriand got destroyed, but he saved the Noldor and the Edain. So we're gonna give Gondolind an A. Gondor. I mean, I feel like this is easy. Gondor was, it's, as Boromir says, I know he says it in the films, I'm not sure if he says it in the books, it's by the blood of our people are your lands kept safe, and there's 100% true. Gondor really kept the Westlands of Middle-earth safe throughout all the end of the Second Age, and then all into the Third Age, all throughout the Third Age too. It was the strongest kingdom strongest kingdom of the Third Age for such a long time. It got close to not close to the glory of Numenor, but it was I think a worthy successor of Numenor, especially around the sort of 1000 to sort of 1400 of the Third Age. Gondor was supremely powerful. It controlled a huge empire. They fought in battles, from Umbar to the Sea of Rune to even north in Angmar. Even at the end, Gondor was still putting up a massive fight. Gondor goes in S. 100% Gondor is S. There you go. We got an S. The Grey Mountains. Okay, this is I'm referring to the Dwarven Kingdom, that existed sort of between 2200 of the Third Age to about 2590 of the Third Age. The Dwarves left Moria. They lived for a while in Arabore, but then decided that the Grey Mountains were nicer because they were less explored and more sort of wealthy. So the Dwarves ended up in the Grey Mountains. Didn't stay there too long, though, because they attracted dragons. And those dragons eventually ended up driving the Dwarves out, and then they ended up taking one step further a couple hundred years later, and Smaug ended up in Erebor. I don't think there's much else to say about the Grey Mountains. I mean, they didn't really have a lasting legacy. The Grey Mountains were a pretty terrible place at the end of the Third Age, sort of infested by orcs, and then the Withered Heath was a dragon breeding ground. But they didn't really do anything negative. They're going in C. Hiflam. Okay. I mean, Hiflam was not the most glorious of the First Age realms. It didn't have an incredible city like Gondolind or Nargothrond or Menegroth. But the one thing Hiflam had was balls. Hiflam was the primary fighter against Morgoth under Fingolfin and then Fingon. Hiflam was always contesting the strongest out of any other realm with Angband. It wasn't the most beautiful place, but they really were. They were defenders of Beleriand. And, I think it's telling that after the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, they'd contributed so much that basically Morgoth just walked in and took the place because they had given every little thing that they had to defend Beleriand against him. I think they go in S. Honestly, I think they go in S. I think simply because of just the effort, just the insane amount of effort. They were, present in so many different battles. Yeah, S. I don't know if you can hear it, but it started raining outside. Okay, what have we got? The Iron Hills. When I think of the Iron Hills, I think of longevity. The Iron Hills were, alongside... You see now, places like Arabore and the Grey Mountains, they were colonized by the dwarves after Moria had fallen. The Iron Hills were not. The Iron Hills were colonized by Durin's folk even as Moria existed, so the Iron Hills lasted for a very long time. They clearly couldn't have been that terrible a place to live, because dwarves kept living there. Even when, when the Grey Mountains were lost, many dwarves then went to the Iron Hills. When Erebor was lost, many dwarves went to the Iron Hills. They didn't follow, Thror and Thrain and Thorin to Dunland and then the Blue Mountains. A lot of them stayed there. So it must have been a nice enough place. The Iron Hills suggests, lots of iron. So maybe it wasn't insanely wealthy. Maybe you couldn't find huge amounts of gold and silver and other precious gems in there, but clearly it was a fine enough place. It lasted a long time. I don't think I'm gonna give it an A, to be honest, because I don't think anywhere in Middle-earth lasted longer than the Iron Hills, really. I think it deserves to go there for that. Alright, Khazad-dûm. The greatest, most glorious of the Dwarven realms that was destroyed because they delved too greedily and too deep in the end. This is a tough one, because well, I mean, it's tough because I just don't know. Is there a huge amount to say about Khazad-dûm? They were the greatest of the Dwarven realms. They lasted the longest of the Dwarven realms, except the Iron Hills. Although the Iron Hills were technically vassals for a long time. I'm conflicted. Does Khazad-dûm... I mean, they did fight against Sauron. They were active against the Orcs of the Misty Mountains. They did fight against them even in the First and Second Age. They fought against Orcs that were coming from Angband. They... yeah, fought against Sauron a couple of times. You know, all the dwarves really wanted to go back there. I mean, they produced Mithril. So much Mithril. We'll put them in S. Khazad-dûm I think it deserves to be S, because, I mean, what a place. What a place. Okay. We have Lindon. When I'm talking about Lindon here, I'm talking about when it was Gil-galad's kingdom at the start of the Second Age, all the way until the end of the Third Age, when it was ruled by Círdan. So obviously, Lindon had longevity. It lasted a very long time, although one could say it's because it was, you know, probably one of the, you know, geographically one of the safest places in Middle-earth. I mean, it was located far from the evil of the East. It had, you know, natural barriers in the River Lune and the Blue Mountains. They had quite, you know, they fought a lot. They fought a lot against Sauron in the Second Age, you know, the War of the Elves and Sauron, and then in the War of the Last Alliance, after Gil-galad was killed, it sort of officially ended as a kingdom. It was just ruled by Círdan, but it still contributed quite a lot. Lindon helped out Arnor quite a lot, helped out Arthedain, helped him out in multiple wars, and, you know, then contributed to the destruction of Angmar. I mean, I feel like the one thing that prevents me from putting them in S is that I don't think Lindon had the sort of fame of any of the other ones that are in the S tier, I guess. They didn't have the same, like they definitely had an impact, but I wouldn't say the same long-lasting legacy. I mean, yeah, Gondor and Hiflam are in there because they were fighters. Khazad-dûm's in there because of its glory. Lindon, it doesn't really match any of that stuff, I feel like. But I think it's a solid A for me. Okay, what have we got here? Lorian. Lothlorien. Okay. So Lothlorien, I guess, come to think of it, Lothlorien also lasted a, you know, an enormously long time as far as we know. It probably actually lasted longer than the Iron Hills. So for longevity, Lothlorien, you know, scores a lot of points there in my completely made up point system. But Lothlorien, I think, contributed a lot. You know, in the Second Age, they fought against... they fought in the War of the Elves and Sauron. They fought in the War of the Last Alliance. They even fought against the wars in against Angmar. Elves from Lothlorien even crossed the Misty Mountains to fight against Angmar. They helped out a lot, even during the late Third Age. They, you know, helped out the Aethiod when they were riding to Gondor's aid during the Battle of the Fields of Celebrant. Even during the War of the Ring, Lothlorien was attacked 3 times and fought off each assault and then crossed the river and destroyed Dol Guldur. I think the only thing that's preventing me from putting them in an S is that it was a small place that just didn't have the sort of massive, huge impact that other places did. But considering its geographic size and probably its comparatively smaller population, Lothlorien definitely packed a big punch. They definitely achieved quite a lot, did quite a lot, so I think Lothlorien goes in A. Mirkwood. Okay, we're talking about the realms of Oropher and then his son, Thranduil. Okay. I think this one... They didn't contribute as much as Lothlorien. They did help out in some things, but they were much more isolationist. They weren't really... The Elves of Mirkwood didn't really want much to do with the Noldor. They didn't really want much to do with the Dwarves. So They were quite isolationist, but they did help out from time to time. They fought in the War of the Last Alliance, and then they also, fought in the Battle of the Five Armies, the War of the Ring. They weren't destroyed. They lasted quite a long time. Probably, realistically, I think of all the Elven realms, going into the Fourth Age, Mirkwood would have still lasted the longest. I think they deserve a B. They definitely don't deserve anything lower than that, but I don't think I can put them higher than a B, to be honest. Nargothrond. Okay, well, this one is... Oh, this one is tough. Because I think, even though everyone loves Finrod Felagund, I feel like Nargothrond is overrated. Because they were powerful. Nargothrond was said to be quite a cool city. Cool, that's definitely not the words that Tolkien used. But they just didn't do much with it. They didn't really help out much during the wars in Beleriand. Definitely, I think of all the major realms, Nargothrond did the least. And then they ended up being ruled by Orodreth, who basically gave in to Turin Turambar and then suicided the kingdom at the Battle of Tumhalad, I believe, against Glaurung and an army of orcs. And then Nargothrond was destroyed, so they kind of didn't really do much during the First Age when it mattered. They only really became active when the war was, it was a foregone conclusion that Morgoth was going to win. They only became active then, which was, a really dumb decision because Nargothrond, if Hiflam and the Feanorians and all of those other peoples together weren't able to stop Morgoth, then what chance did Nargothrond had? It was just a really dumb decision. This is, this might... I think some people might not agree with this, but I think Nargothrond gets a C. I really think they get a C because, they were powerful, they really were, but they just didn't do anything with it. They did less than Doriath. Unfortunately, Nargothrond, you go in C. Nogrod. Okay. All my boys hate Nogrod. The thing is with Nogrod is that they weren't as helpful as Belegost as far as we know. There's actually no mention of Nogrod participating in the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, where an army from Belegost showed up to help. There's no mention of an army of Nogrod. Now, they might have showed up. It is mentioned that the Blue Mountains were very active with the forging of weapons and armor, so Nogrod may have helped supply the war. But there's no mention of them actually fighting in the war. So we don't really know how much Nogrod did in regards to the war against Morgoth. But here's the bad thing. The dwarves of Nogrod destroyed Doriath. So, as far as we know, their only major contribution to the war against Morgoth was actually doing him a favor by knocking out one of Morgoth's biggest foes. So, simply because, they really just had a negative impact, Nogrod is our first D. Numenor. Well, I feel like this one's obvious. We're talking about the most powerful empire that the world had ever seen, really. They've, had huge colonies, they had a massive fleet, massive armies. They tried to challenge... They sailed to Valinor and tried to challenge the gods. It says a lot when your kingdom has to be destroyed by, a literal god intervening and sinking it into the ocean. I think that's the only argument you could make that Numenor is not an S tier. That they kind of destroyed themselves in such a ludicrous way. But with the huge impact that they had, a legacy that lasted thousands of years and probably thousands of years more, it would be silly not to rank Numenor in S. you can't not rank the most powerful kingdom to ever exist. You can't rank that not in this. Assyriand. Assyriand was the realm of the Green Elves in the very south east of Beleriand. Now, the Green Elves... this is an awkward one too, because the Green Elves, they helped out in the very first battle in Beleriand. And they got their asses kicked quite a bit. The battle ended up being a victory, but the Green Elves lost a lot. They lost their king, they never chose a new one, and then they basically just, from that point on, didn't really help much in the war against Morgoth. But one could say that that was a kind of smart thing to do, because basically Assyrian sort of avoided Morgoth's attention. I mean, there's no mention of Assyrian actually being invaded and destroyed in the end. So, you know, you kind of have to give it to the Green Elves. They kind of knew what they were doing. Kind of selfish, but I mean, you know, the one time they did try and fight, they really did lose pretty badly. I think Assyrian can go in B. I mean, compared to their contemporaries, who all got destroyed, Assyrian, you know, avoided that fate, so yeah, it's quite smart. You know what I just realized the entire time? I could have been doing... Oh. What if we no crop it? Oh. Well, anyway. Glad I figured that out towards the end. But we're not doing it again. Now you guys can see. You guys can see where everything is. Okay, Ravanian. Okay. Ravanian was the kingdom of the Northmen that existed between, sort of, in the lands just east of Mirkwood. A valuable ally of Gondor. You could say that Ravanian was sort of the proto Rohan in a way. Was this one's kind of tough because they did help out. They did help out Gondor a lot, but then they were destroyed by the Wainwrighter Easterlings. They're definitely getting a high ranking either way. Well, high-ish, I guess you could say. It's just, do they deserve an A or do they deserve a B? Because, I mean, they did help out Gondor a lot. For 600 years, they were a pretty important ally of Gondor. They helped King Eldacar take back his throne. Lots of Northmen moved to Gondor, ended up filling out its army. They provided like a pretty valuable cavalry element. I mean, it's not really their fault they lost to the Wainwrighter Easterlings. They were hit really badly by the Great Plague. I think just because they were destroyed, I think they have to go in B. Unfortunately. This one, yeah. This one I feel conflicted about, but I think B. Rivendell. Okay, I mean, I was very conflicted about actually including Rivendell in this list because Rivendell is just a small refuge. It was built as a refuge. But then, sort of politically, it did end up having a pretty important impact throughout the rest of the rest of the Second and Third Age. They did contribute forces to wars. They were even besieged by Angmar at one point. A lot of important things took place in Rivendell. Not even, that's the War of the Last Alliance was there at one point. There was obviously late in the Third Age, the Council of Elrond. The heirs of the chieftains of the Dunedain were raised in Rivendell, all that. So it was quite important. I don't think it was a mere refuge in the end. It ended up being quite an important place. In terms of impact, I mean, it's kind of tough because Rivendell wasn't very powerful. Like I said, it was just a refuge. It probably, I think at its absolute peak, it probably didn't field more than maybe 1,000 soldiers, who knows? So it's kind of hard to say. It's kind of hard to say where do we put Rivendell here. Because it wasn't powerful. It wasn't as powerful as any of these other things here. But it did have quite an impact for how small it was. I think B. I think B simply because it was just a refuge. It wasn't even a city. It just didn't have the power. I don't think it just had the power that even, deserve a spot in A. Okay, Rohan. Rohan. Everyone knows what Rohan is. Gondor's faithful allies who helped them out quite a bit over the years. I mean, there's not much to say here. I think Rohan doesn't really deserve S because, yeah, they just weren't as long-lasting. They didn't have, and I don't think they had the impact to be put in S, but I think Rohan still definitely does deserve an A. I mean, I don't think you can argue that Rohan deserves anything lower than an A. Rhudaur. Well, this one's easy. Rhudaur, the third successor state of Arnor. Rhudaur was seemingly the weakest, the most remote, and ended up actually, the Dunedain there ended up being overthrown by Hillmen, who threw their lot in with Angmar. So, you could argue that Rhudaur doesn't actually deserve to be on this list because it ended up being an evil kingdom in the end. But it did start as a good kingdom. I mean, Numenor also was the same. But, I mean, the fact that Rhudaur ended up fighting against the rest of Arnor, I think it's pretty obvious where they go. They get our second D. And we're down to our last, the Shire. For some reason, I was also conflicted about putting the Shire on the list because they're not really a political entity, so to speak. But, I mean, there's enough people living there. It's big enough. They do technically sort of have, well, honorary rulers, I guess you could say, with, like, the Thane and the Mayor of Mickle-Delving and the Master of Buckland, all that kind of stuff. One thing about the Shire is that it was shown to, the only reason why the Shire existed was because of the Rangers. I mean, you could say the same thing about Breland. The Shire only existed because of the Rangers protecting it. It couldn't really stand on its own. There's several points in history where it had to really be helped by the Rangers to survive. But then, they did win a battle against orcs, so they weren't that useless. I think I would have put the Shire in a C tier, but there's one thing that I think you can't ignore is that the people that the Shire produced, produced Bilbo, it produced Frodo and all these companions, and look at the huge impact they ended up having on the world. So, regardless of the Shire's, lack of power, its somewhat inability to stand on its own 2 feet, I think it has to go in at least a B. I don't think you can put it any lower than a B. Okay, well that rounds out our list. In S we have Gondor, Hiflam, Khazad-dûm, and Numenor. In A we have Belegost, Aethiod, Gondolin, Iron Hills, Lindon, Lorian, Rohan. B we have Arthedain, the Blue Mountains, Brethil, Doriath, Arabore, the Falas, Mirkwood, Osiriand, Ravanian, Rivendell, the Shire. And C, Arnor, Cardolan, Dale, Dorthonion, Eregion, the Feanorians, Grey Mountains, and Nargothrond. And in D, we have Nogrod and Rhudaur. Well, thank you for watching. Let me know if you enjoyed it. Let me know if, well, I imagine there's probably going to be lots of disagreements. So please let me know about where you would have put certain things. Does Nargothrond deserve as low as a C? Does Gondolind deserve as high as an A? Does Rhudaur deserve a D? It definitely does. You cannot possibly argue that Rhudaur does not deserve a D. I would love to see someone... If you can convince me that Rhudaur deserves higher than a D, then I can't really offer you a reward, but I will, I'll pin your comment. But yeah, let me know if you'd like me to do more of these. I sort of wanted to do something new like this as sort of like a 50,000 subscriber sort of special thing. I don't really have the ability to live stream right now, so I just decided to do it sort of. It's not live, but it's, you know, live off the top of my head. Once again, I'm not reading. I didn't read from a script here at all, which is going to make the next bit really difficult, because now I have to tell you a joke. I have to end the video the same way I always do, except I don't have it written down. And sometimes it's really difficult to write it down. So, okay, let's think. Cheers, farewell, and remember... let's do something cheap. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you think Rudour deserves higher than a D, then you're an idiot.